Commander XY Lore had fought across the void of space for over 200 cycles. His name was whispered in fear across conquered worlds, his battle strategies studied by young Zenthari cadets as the pinnacle of military genius. He was not just a warrior, he was a force of nature, a conqueror whose fleets had crushed entire civilizations beneath the unyielding might of the Dominion. Yet, as he stood within the Grand War Chamber aboard the flagship Veilzor, he felt none of the usual excitement that came before an invasion. Instead, an unfamiliar sensation crept into his thoughts, an unease that settled deep in his secondary heart. The chamber was bathed in the cold, sterile glow of holographic star maps, the projected light illuminating the intricate details of Earth's position in the galactic spiral. The blue-green world spun slowly before him, its continents and oceans deceptively peaceful. To the untrained eye, it appeared no different from 100 other primitive worlds the Zenthari had subjugated. But XY Lore had never relied on appearances. He studied his enemies, learned their weaknesses, and exploited their every flaw. That was why he had never known defeat. He clenched his claws behind his back, the sharp tips pressing against the hardened ridges of his armor. His adjutant, Captain Vorkan, stood at attention beside him, waiting for the order to initiate the invasion sequence. The fleet was already in position. The strike teams were armed, the orbital bombardment planned to precision. By all calculations, this should have been another swift and decisive conquest. And yet, something gnawed at the edges of XY Lore's mind. The briefings had been clear: humans were technologically inferior, their weapons primitive by Dominion standards. Their ships were slow, their defenses laughably outdated. But war was never just about weapons. It was about resilience, adaptation, and, above all, the willingness to fight beyond reason. That was the part that concerned him. For all their technological inferiority, humans had resisted before. There were reports of skirmishes along the outer colonies, encounters where human vessels had held their own far longer than expected. There were whispers of their unconventional strategies, of their refusal to surrender even when faced with annihilation. That kind of defiance was unusual. It was dangerous. He turned to Vorkan, his voice steady but lacking its usual sharp command. "Bring up the historical combat data on this species. I want a full analysis." Vorkan hesitated for only a fraction of a second before obeying, the slight pause almost imperceptible but enough to confirm XY Lore's suspicions. He was not the only one with doubts. The adjutant's fingers moved swiftly over the control panel, and a new projection appeared in the center of the war chamber. It was not a simple military dossier. It was something far more disturbing. The holographic display flickered to life, showcasing a vast timeline of human conflicts. It began with crude depictions of battles fought with sharpened metal and wooden shields, primitive armies clashing in chaotic formations. But as the timeline progressed, the battles evolved with terrifying speed. In mere millennia, a blink in the cosmic scale, humanity had advanced from swords to firearms, from cannons to mechanized warfare. The scale of destruction grew exponentially. Cities reduced to rubble. Entire nations consumed by fire. A species that did not merely fight for survival but fought as if war itself was an inseparable part of its existence. XY Lore leaned in, his eyes narrowing as he studied the most recent conflicts. He saw vast armies locked in brutal trench warfare, soldiers enduring months of unrelenting suffering, their spirits unbroken despite unspeakable conditions. He witnessed the rise of aerial combat, where humans took to the skies not to flee, but to turn the heavens into yet another battlefield. And then, there was something worse. Something he had not expected. Weapons of total annihilation. The data streams revealed the horrors of nuclear warfare, detonations that turned entire cities to ash in an instant. The records detailed the aftermath, the radiation poisoning, the long-term consequences suffered not just by those caught in the blast, but by generations afterward. This was not mere destruction, this was an act of war so absolute that it scarred the very fabric of existence. He could feel Vorkan watching him, waiting for a reaction. XY Lore said nothing, his gaze fixed on the most chilling part of the report. The humans had used such weapons on their own kind. Not once, but multiple times. And even after witnessing the devastation firsthand, they had not sworn off war. They had not collapsed under the weight of their own atrocities. No, if anything, they had only grown more adept at wielding destruction. A slow realization settled into his mind, heavier than any battlefield decision he had ever faced. If humans were willing to do this to each other, what would they do to an enemy? The Zenthari were conquerors. They had faced resistance before, dealt with stubborn species who fought to the bitter end. But there was a crucial difference. Other civilizations fought out of necessity, out of a desperate attempt to preserve what little they had left. Humans fought because they could. Because war was not just a means of survival for them, it was part of their nature. HFY Lore exhaled slowly, forcing his claws to unclench. He could not allow emotion to dictate his decisions. And yet, the more he examined the data, the more the unease in his chest solidified into something far more dangerous. For the first time in his long and decorated career, he was beginning to wonder if he was about to make a mistake. Commander HFY Lore remained motionless, his gaze locked onto the glowing projections before him. The war chamber was silent except for the faint hum of the data processors cycling through terabytes of human combat records. His secondary heart pounded against his ribs in a slow, deliberate rhythm, as if his body was processing the same grim realization that had taken root in his mind. He had seen wars before, had orchestrated them with ruthless efficiency, yet nothing in his long and violent career had prepared him for the sheer madness that was human warfare. He forced himself to move, shifting his stance as he gestured toward Vorkan. The adjutant stiffened but did not speak. He was waiting, watching, trying to read his commander's reaction. HFY Lore had never hesitated before. He had led fleets through burning atmospheres, walked among the ruins of civilizations that had dared defy the Zenthari dominion, and never once had he questioned his purpose. Until now. Continue, HFY Lore commanded, his voice even but lacking its usual authority. Vorkan hesitated for only a fraction of a second before pressing a control panel embedded into the holotable. The holographic projection shifted, zooming into a more detailed report. These are first-hand accounts, Vorkan said, his tone carefully neutral. Captured human records, transcripts, and personal logs from their soldiers. I selected those that exemplify their psychological resilience in combat situations. HFY Lore didn't need an explanation. He could already sense where this was going. He had studied enemies before, understood their tactics, their limitations. But this was something different. He wasn't just studying human warfare. He was beginning to understand human mindsets. The first transcript began to play. A flickering visual recording showed a human soldier, his uniform tattered, his face streaked with blood and dirt. His eyes, however, were something else entirely. They weren't filled with fear, nor the resignation of a man who had accepted his fate. No, his eyes burned with something else, something unnerving. A kind of defiance HFY Lore had rarely seen outside of the most suicidal insurgents. The soldier's voice, though strained, carried a grim amusement. They thought we'd break. Thought if they cut us off, bombed us from orbit, surrounded our position, we'd beg for mercy. He coughed, wiping at his mouth with the back of his hand. They don't understand. We don't fight to survive. We fight to win. And if we can't win, we make sure the other guy loses just as bad. HFY Lore narrowed his eyes. The man's posture, his tone, it was not the bravado of a dying warrior trying to mask his fear. It was something deeper, more ingrained. This was not just a soldier. This was a product of a species that had been tempered in the forge of relentless conflict. The recording ended, and Vorkan immediately pulled up another. This one was a recovered message from a human pilot. His fighter had been struck, his oxygen levels dropping, yet he had calmly recorded his final words. Tell my squadron not to worry. I took 3 of them with me. He exhaled, his breath ragged but steady. Not a bad trade. Not bad at all. The screen went dark. HFY Lore clenched his jaw. His mind calculated the implications faster than he could fully process them. This was not just about advanced weaponry or strategy. It was about a psychological edge. Humans accepted death in a way few species did. Not with passive surrender, not with hopelessness, but with the understanding that death was merely a tactical inconvenience. They do not fear defeat, HFY Lore muttered under his breath, more to himself than to Vorkan. Vorkan glanced at him but remained silent. There was nothing to add. The recordings spoke for themselves. HFY Lore's claws tapped lightly against the edge of the holotable. There had to be a weakness. Every species had one. Some civilizations crumbled under sustained losses, their will breaking when their leadership collapsed. Others could not withstand prolonged sieges, their resources too limited for drawn-out conflict. But humans, if these reports were accurate, seemed almost designed to endure suffering. He shifted his gaze back to the data, scanning through battle records of human engagements against superior forces. They had been outgunned, outnumbered, pushed to the brink of annihilation, and yet they had adapted, endured, and in many cases, emerged victorious. "Show me the Battle of Cinder's Wake," HFY Lore ordered. Vorkan's fingers moved across the control panel, bringing up the next segment of the archive. A tactical overview displayed the engagement: an outnumbered human battalion, cut off from reinforcements, stranded on a barren moon with no hope of retreat. The opposing force had superior firepower, advanced aerial support, and complete control of the battlefield. Yet the humans had one. HFY Lore studied the footage, his mandibles tightening as he observed the strategy unfold. The humans had allowed themselves to be surrounded, forcing their enemies into a false sense of security. Then, through calculated suicide charges and misdirection, they turned their disadvantage into an opportunity, ambushing their attackers in the dead of night, using their own terrain as a weapon. They had no hope of survival, yet they fought like they had already won. The footage ended. The report summarized the outcome: 90% of the human forces perished, but they had taken down an entire fleet's worth of enemy ground troops before being extracted. It was not a victory in conventional terms. It was something worse, a message. HFY Lore straightened, his claws tightening behind his back. There would be no easy conquest. The invasion he had planned, one of overwhelming force and swift planetary control, would not work. The moment human forces realized they were losing, they would resort to something terrifying. They would fight as if survival was secondary. That was the key difference. The Zenthari, for all their military prowess, fought wars to expand, to conquer, to secure resources and dominance. But humans, they fought because it was in their very nature. When pushed to the brink, they would drag their enemies into hell with them. HFY Lore exhaled, his voice low but firm. "Prepare a full-scale reassessment of our invasion strategy." Vorkan hesitated, then nodded. He did not question the order. He had seen the same footage. He understood. As HFY Lore turned away from the projections, his mind raced through the possibilities. The invasion was no longer a question of how many ships or soldiers they could deploy. It was a question of whether it was worth the cost. And for the first time in his long career, he was beginning to suspect the answer. Commander HFY Lore stood in the dim glow of the war chamber, his claws resting lightly on the edge of the holotable. The flickering projections before him had long since ceased their playback, yet his mind continued to replay the footage, dissecting every human battle strategy, every act of defiance, every moment of ruthless determination that defied all logic. The room was silent, save for the faint hum of the ship's systems, a low vibration beneath his feet that barely registered against the storm raging in his thoughts. He had ordered a full-scale reassessment of the invasion strategy, but what troubled him now was not merely tactical. It was something deeper, something he could not yet name. He had studied countless species, had crushed civilizations that had once called themselves mighty, yet never before had he hesitated. Never before had he felt this gnawing doubt. Vorkan stood at attention beside him, his posture rigid. The adjutant had followed HFY Lore for years, through victory after victory, through campaigns that had reshaped entire sectors of the galaxy. Yet now, there was a tension in him that had never been there before. He had seen what HFY Lore had seen. He understood. HFY Lore exhaled sharply, pushing away his unease. "What of their psychological endurance?" he asked, his voice steady. "Tactics and technology are one thing. I want to know how far they can break before they shatter." Vorkan hesitated only a fraction before activating a new data stream. The holographic projection shifted, displaying a collection of classified reports extracted from human sources. Prisoner logs. Battlefield debriefings. Psychological evaluations. It was a study of the human mind under pressure, under suffering, under the slow and deliberate hand of destruction. XY Lore studied the first report. A human soldier had been captured after a skirmish on a contested planet. The Zenthri interrogators had followed standard procedure: sensory deprivation, physiological stressors, starvation cycles. A proven method. Most species cracked within days. Yet the human had lasted 3 weeks, speaking only in riddles, in deliberate nonsense meant to frustrate and mislead his captors. When his body had finally reached the breaking point, when his physical state had deteriorated beyond function, he had used the last of his strength to laugh. XY Lore narrowed his eyes, his claws pressing against the table's edge. He knew he was dying, yet he found amusement in it? Vorkan nodded. They call it gallows humor. A coping mechanism. It seems to be a common psychological trait. XY Lore exhaled through his nostrils. It was not defiance in the way he understood it. It was something else, something unnerving in its simplicity. Vorkan brought up another case. A pilot who had been stranded in enemy territory, hunted for weeks before being captured. He had endured isolation, extreme temperatures, untreated wounds, yet when finally confronted, he had refused to provide anything of value. Not through silence, not through resistance, but through mockery. He had insulted his captors, turned their interrogations into a game. Even as his body failed, he had continued. When the records detailed his eventual death, it was not through submission. It was through one final act of defiance, breaking free just long enough to ensure his captors died alongside him. XY Lore flexed his claws, his mind working through the implications. They endure suffering, not because they must, but because they refuse to give their enemy satisfaction. Vorkan nodded again, this time with a weight behind his movement. And it is not limited to soldiers. Civilian populations exhibit similar behaviors under siege conditions. Their history is filled with instances of entire cities choosing destruction over surrender. XY Lore's jaw tightened. War was not about endurance alone. It was about breaking the enemy, grinding them down until resistance was no longer an option. But how did one break an enemy that took pride in its own resilience? How did one conquer a species that welcomed the challenge of survival? He turned away from the holodeble, his gaze fixed on the large viewport overlooking the darkness of space. Below them, Earth remained distant yet impossibly close. It was not the size of the planet that troubled him. It was the weight of what it contained. A species that did not just survive war, but thrived in it. He could feel Vorkan watching him, waiting for a decision that had not yet taken form in his mind. The Zenthri had crushed countless worlds, had reduced civilizations to dust with a precision that left no room for error. Yet as XY Lore stood here, with every advantage at his disposal, he could not shake the feeling that this war, this conquest, was something else entirely. A war was meant to be won. But what if victory came at a cost the Dominion could not afford? What if, in fighting humans, they were not the predators, but the prey? Commander XY Lore had always trusted logic above all else. War was a calculated process, a series of predictable actions and reactions, guided by superior strategy and overwhelming force. The Zenthri Dominion had refined warfare to an art, their conquests unfolding with methodical precision. He had never encountered an enemy he could not defeat, a species that could not be bent to the will of the Dominion. But as he stood within the command chamber, his thoughts coiled tightly around a singular, inescapable realization. This war would not unfold as the others had. The data was clear, undeniable. Humanity's history of war was not merely one of conflict, it was one of transformation. They did not fight to preserve what they had, they fought to become stronger. Every war they endured reshaped them, refined them, honed them into something more dangerous than before. If the Dominion struck them down, they would not fall. They would adapt. They would retaliate. And that, more than anything, unsettled him. His claws tightened behind his back as he turned toward Vorkan. The adjutant had remained silent since the last report, standing rigidly at attention, his gaze fixed ahead. He was waiting for a command, for some indication that his leader had formulated a plan to counter what they had learned. But XY Lore gave no such order. Instead, he spoke with a measured tone. "I want more." Vorken inclined his head slightly. "More of what, Commander?" XY Lore exhaled slowly. "Not just their wars. Not just their tactics. I want to understand how they think, how they endure. What drives them to fight beyond reason?" Vorken hesitated, but only for a moment. He turned to the holotable, his fingers gliding over the controls with practiced efficiency. The display shifted, replacing battle records with something more unsettling: personal testimonies. The words of humans who had lived through war. Not soldiers, not strategists, but civilians. XY Lore studied the first entry. It was a transcript, taken from a human woman who had survived a planetary siege. The Dominion had long used such tactics to break the will of resistance movements, cutting off resources, bombarding cities, reducing populations to starvation until surrender was inevitable. It was a strategy that had never failed. Yet, as he read her words, he felt a slow, cold weight settle in his chest. We didn't wait to die. We fought with whatever we had: knives, stones, our bare hands if necessary. They thought breaking our supplies would break us. But the moment we had nothing left to lose, we became something else entirely. We didn't just resist. We made sure that every inch they gained cost them more than they could afford. XY Lore clenched his jaw. He had read countless accounts of war, but this was different. It was not desperation. It was not simple survival. It was deliberate. These people did not surrender to logic. They did not fight only when they had a chance to win. They fought because to stop fighting was never an option. Vorken activated another file. This time, it was a visual recording. The image flickered to life, revealing an older human man, his face lined with age but his eyes sharp with something far more dangerous than anger: conviction. "We used to think war was a failure," the man said, his voice calm, steady. "That peace was the natural state of things. But peace is an illusion. The moment you believe in it, you become weak. And weakness invites destruction." He leaned forward, his gaze piercing even through the recording. "We learned that the hard way. We learned that peace isn't something you have, it's something you win. And if you're not willing to fight for it, you don't deserve it." The recording ended. XY Lore exhaled through his nostrils, the tension in his limbs growing with each new revelation. This was no ordinary enemy. Conquering a planet, defeating an army, these were straightforward tasks. But how did one conquer a species that refused to accept defeat? His thoughts spiraled through every campaign he had ever fought, searching for a precedent. The Dominion had crushed civilizations with superior firepower, with precise strikes against leadership structures, with the eradication of key resources. But humans did not break the way other species did. Even when they lost, they did not truly lose. They learned, they adapted, they changed. Vorken spoke carefully. "Commander, if I may offer an observation." XY Lore turned his gaze to him. "Speak." Vorken straightened, choosing his words with care. "The Dominion has always operated on the principle that war is a means to an end. Conquest, expansion, control. But humans do not view war the same way. They do not fight for gain alone. They fight for identity. For them, war is not just a tool, it is part of their nature." XY Lore let the silence stretch between them. The realization had been forming in his mind since he first began studying their history, but now it was undeniable. Humanity did not just survive war. It was forged by it. He turned away from the holotable, his gaze shifting toward the viewport. The vastness of space stretched before him, but it was the distant blue-green sphere of Earth that held his focus. Every instinct told him to act. To press forward, to strike before the enemy had time to react. Yet, for the first time, he hesitated. Not out of fear, not out of doubt, but out of something deeper. Understanding. This war, if fought, would not be like the others. It would not end with a single decisive strike. It would not conclude with the surrender of Earth's leaders or the collapse of its infrastructure. No, if the Dominion engaged in full-scale war with humanity, it would be something far worse. A war with no end. A war that would reshape not just Earth, but the Dominion itself. XY Lore turned back to Vorkan, his decision clear. Prepare a council meeting. I want every high-ranking strategist present. The invasion plan is no longer viable. We need to reassess our entire approach. Vorkan did not question the order. He simply bowed his head in acknowledgement before stepping away to carry it out. XY Lore remained in place, his gaze locked on the distant world below. He had seen many planets in his lifetime, had conquered many civilizations. But Earth was different. And for the first time in his long, undefeated career, he was beginning to wonder if this was a war the Dominion should not fight at all. Commander XY Lore sat alone in the war chamber, his claws tapping lightly against the smooth surface of the holotable. The usual quiet hum of the ship's systems seemed deafening now, filling the space where once his certainty had been. The weight of command had never burdened him before. He had led countless campaigns, shattered enemies with precision, and ensured that the Dominion's rule remained unchallenged. But now, as the distant blue-green world of Earth hovered in the void beyond the viewport, he felt something unfamiliar creeping into his thoughts. Doubt. The council meeting had lasted for hours, with high-ranking strategists presenting detailed invasion models, counter-resistance measures, and planetary control scenarios. Every plan, every contingency, every projection had led to the same conclusion. The Dominion could not afford this war. Not in the way it had waged wars before. Not against a species that would refuse to die quietly. XY Lore had listened as his officers debated, some insisting that the humans could be broken with overwhelming force, others warning that conquest would only ignite a war unlike any the Dominion had ever known. Even those who had initially advocated for invasion had faltered when presented with the evidence. Every time humanity had been pushed to the brink, it had not only survived but emerged stronger. Now, in the silence of his chamber, XY Lore found himself staring at the final assessment displayed before him. Projected losses. Estimated resistance longevity. Psychological resilience factors. It was not the numbers that troubled him. It was what they represented. The Dominion could defeat humanity in a single decisive campaign, but the war would not end there. Every human that fell would be replaced by another. Every city reduced to rubble would become a symbol, a rallying cry for vengeance. And when the Dominion inevitably declared victory, it would be left ruling over a species that had never accepted subjugation. His claws curled into fists. Conquering a planet was one thing. Holding it against a species that turned war into an identity was another. A chime echoed through the chamber, breaking his thoughts. Vorkan stood at the entrance, his expression unreadable. "Commander," he said carefully. "The fleet awaits your final order." XY Lore exhaled slowly. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing against him, the decision he was about to make shifting the course of not just this campaign, but perhaps the entire Dominion. His gaze returned to the holotable. A final report had been added to the data stream. Not tactical projections, not resistance models, but something else entirely: an intercepted human communication, a message broadcast across Earth's defense networks. A woman's voice played through the chamber, calm and unwavering. "If you come for us, we will not run. If you strike us down, we will not vanish. If you burn our cities, we will rebuild them stronger. We are not the strongest, nor the fastest, nor the most advanced. But we are the ones who endure. We have learned from every war, every loss, every hardship. We are not afraid of you." XY Lore's jaw tightened. There was no bravado in her voice. No arrogance. Just certainty. He straightened, turning to Vorkan. "Send the recall order. We are leaving." For the first time in all the years they had fought side by side, Vorkan hesitated. He was a soldier, raised in a culture where retreat was unthinkable. But he was also a strategist, and he had seen the same reports. He knew what XY Lore knew. He inclined his head in acknowledgement and stepped away to relay the command. XY lore turned back to the viewport, watching as the planet continued to spin below. A world that would never be conquered. A species that would never yield. The Dominion had faced many enemies. It had destroyed civilizations, rewritten histories, erased entire cultures from existence. But this war would have devoured them both. He had spent his entire life believing that war was about dominance, about proving superiority through force. But now, he understood the truth. War was not about who had the strongest weapons or the largest fleets. War was about who could endure. Who could rise from the ashes. And in that, the humans had already won.